Welcome to Silverside Online, Silverside Sunday morning for December the 27th, 2020, the last Sunday in this calendar year. I will be taking 3 Sundays away. Bill Englehart will be speaking next Sunday, the following Sunday. There will be some Silverside people talking about their hopes and dreams for 2021. That will be the online gathering. And then on the 3rd Sunday in January, Dr. Carson Brisson, professor of Bible and Biblical Languages at Union Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, my dear friend since seminary days, will be our guest online preacher. But for today, welcome. I'm glad you're here. And I hope this morning's message stuns you, shocks you, disorients you, makes you uncomfortable, leaves you uncomfortable, but hopeful. For many of us, perhaps most of us, in this congregation, the church, or a series of congregations that we have belonged to across the years, has or have been important to us in many cases, a key source of support in our lives. We have known of instances where, when relocating, people have chosen a church first and then a residence in proximity to that church. Faithful churchgoers used to shop for a church by seeing how readily they could verify that each item on their fairly short shopping list was readily noticeable, available, and so forth when they made their first visit. Back in the day, most serious church shoppers would have had on their shopping list the name of a particular denomination. One of the reasons that choosing church of a particular denomination mattered was familiarity. American Baptists in one part of the country typically did things very much like American Baptist churches in other parts of the country, not precisely, but essentially. Theological givens didn't have to be explored, explained, discussed, debated. A children's Presbyterian Vacation Bible School program in an East Coast church looked very much like a Presbyterian Vacation Bible School program for children in a church on the West Coast. In those good old days, except for military families and families whose breadwinners worked for companies like DuPont, one of those moves put many families in place for the bulk of the years they would be raising their children. It might well become the place with which an individual or a couple would thereafter permanently identify. The parent or parents remained behind, not following their children or moving back to where they, the parents, had been reared as the locale where they would enjoy their golden years. Some churches were worth that kind of devotion. Maybe most churches were worth that kind of devotion and honestly gave people who joined tremendous long-term personal satisfaction. Somewhere along the way, the relatively high satisfaction with church led most church people in general to believe that the church had always been, and certainly was in their time of experience, a highly satisfactory organization providing highly satisfactory experiences to those who participated within those church organizations, namely local churches and the denominations which supported them referring, of course, to churches that had denominational connections. Certainly all do not, and all did not. Um, Spats within local congregations were subtly acknowledged, and denominational infighting was subtly acknowledged, but generally the idea that there was unity in the Christian community overall was a hallmark, sort of a prize embraced by many people within Christendom, to the extent that there was a Christian Unity Sunday put in the church calendar. every, pardon me, every year. I believe it was the first Sunday in October would be Christian Unity Sunday, when churches would celebrate that we're all one big happy family. Well, I did that in my congregations across the years, believing overall that that was the case. And I was in a position to know better, but somehow I talked myself out of seeing the rancor until the major conflicts within the Southern Baptist Convention split that big denomination wide open, and that opened my eyes to conflicts within other denominations in my time and in history. Yeah, historical conflicts I had read about after my experience of denominational splits and such became much more readily, readily emphatic, I should say, in my thinking. If you look at the chart that's on the screen now before you, you'll see in North America, between 1910 and 2010, the decline of people who identify themselves as Christians in North America, and how that is expected to decline significantly further in the next 30 years. And not everyone who is identifying as Christian, by the way, participates in church. That's another issue entirely. Conflict has certainly been one of the issues. Pardon me. I need more coffee. Conflict has certainly been one of the issues that has damaged the church. My dear friends, that is not the way things are in the church world anymore. People are attending churches in increasingly fewer numbers. It is, and I've been saying this for years, it is institutionally a very serious turn of events, becoming more serious all the time. What are the factors that make it as serious as it is? I'll mention three. One, more and more people are finding their spiritual and fellowship needs met away from churches. Two, fewer and fewer people are making long-term commitments to churches because of increasing numbers of instances of forced employment relocation, or because of the 3 or 4 year career changes many professionals will make in the span of their working lives. And three, churches are preaching and teaching subjects that have no real relevance to the lives of the people who give them the time of day. One of the megachurch preachers, one of the really well-known megachurch preachers, some time ago made kind of a confession to her listeners. It was troubling, to say the least. That she sometimes gets jealous of other megachurch preachers who appear to be getting more attention or more perks than she is. Boo-hoo, honey, boo-hoo. Not many people listening to her whine like she did could possibly match her income level. Some of her hearers might have been offended by that callous comment, but there are so many of them, if they left, they probably would not be missed, at least for a while. Back to the golden era of church affiliation in this country. Those who believed that the church must always be a superior institution probably also believed that it always would and therefore would always be needed, useful, sought after, influential, relevant, and so forth. My, oh my, oh my, oh my, how things have changed. And not nearly as many folks as we had hoped even care that the institutional church has rapidly lost ground and is still losing ground. I think Alan Hirsch was right on target here. However, I now think this ship has sailed. The church, for many people, has become absolutely irrelevant. And I don't think the church, as it has ever been, not something we can go back and recover, the church as it ever has been will fix it. So trying to recreate something from the past will not fix it. It will just plunge the church into further discouragement and irrelevance for the few people willing even to try to be a part of the church in these days. There isn't a single solid reason to think that any communal undertaking will last forever, and yet many of us do. Many of us do because it's easier not to think about what might be or what could be if things changed. Others of us don't think much about it because we think it's silly to speculate about the absence of some institution that we have valued in our lives and our parents before us. But my dear friends, the church as it existed, let us say, during much of the 19th and 20th and early 21st century is coming to an end, maybe has come to an end. When people started talking some years ago about the post-church or the post-Christendom age, instead of scoffing, more of us should have kept our ears perked up and paid attention. This is not to say that there will ever be groups of people lacking the need for spiritual enrichment, encouragement, and inspiration. Spiritual communities are not going to go out of business. But if they're going to sustain themselves, they're going to have to recreate themselves. Let me say it again. If they're going to sustain themselves, they're going to have to recreate themselves. And because in this period of cultural awakening to the reality of corruption in all human institutions, the church included, it is highly likely that to reach many of the people who need to be reached by a spirituality community, it may not be able to call itself a church anymore. It may not be able to call itself a church anymore. Churches, this one included, already discovered that while a certain denominational tag was extremely meaningful and remains meaningful for a number of people, a good number of us, there are more people out there in the big picture who are repulsed by what some of us have loved because they don't see the good that we saw, and maybe it can be said that we don't see the bad that they saw and see in churches and denominations. Plenty of people inside the church will not like what I'm talking about today. And that includes some people tuned in to this online gathering. I suspect, and others in the Silverside family who will hear about what I am saying, certainly plenty of those who will listen very carefully today, will be uncomfortable. I said a few moments ago, I hope you will. With all due respect to those who sincerely disagree with what I'm talking about today, I want to go back and look at Jesus' experience. Some say that if the church was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for them. Those might be the same people who say that the King James Version of the Bible, published in 1611 in England, happens to have been Jesus' favorite translation of the Bible. I've actually heard people say down in my neck of the woods, if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Well, let me stir the pot beyond that declaration. In my journey of learning to interpret Scripture, fairly early on it became rather evident to me that those scholars who were saying some of the material attributed to Jesus, both in terms of words and deeds, got doctored up a little bit on its way to us in order to make a point. Not to lie, not to mislead, but to stress a point. For example, Jesus' original version of his parable of the sower and the seeds had no interpretive commentary attached to the parable when he taught it. Like his other parables, he simply told the story and expected his hearers to draw their own conclusions. It was their responsibility to listen, ponder, draw their own conclusions. But at some later point, to be sure that hearers, after the time of Jesus' original context, but to be sure these people would get his point, editors wove in explanations as if Jesus himself had thrown in the explanations when he first told the parable. Again, I had no difficulties with materials that might have been adjusted a bit, shall we say, for the sake of clarity. What did not occur to me in the earliest challenges of learning biblical interpretation was that there might also have been some stories about Jesus that absolutely were created from scratch to make a point, and others that were recast chronologically to emphasize something Jesus said or did. Hold that thought for just a second. These are stories about Jesus that scholars call post-resurrection narrative. Jesus is out of the tomb, walking around, tying up loose ends before he ascends into the heavenly abode. And it seems that some of what Jesus did or said in that interim, which some of the gospel writers wrote into their respective accounts of Jesus' life and teachings as if uttered or performed before Jesus' execution. That is, they were written into the narrative as if Jesus spoke them before he died rather than after his resurrection. They needed to bolster a point they were trying to make, so they adjusted chronology. In one of those vignettes, Jesus asks Peter and some or all of the disciples gathered with him at that moment, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples started tossing out answers. Well, some think you're John the Baptist, who must not really have died even though he was beheaded, or else he really did die and he's now come back to life. Some think you're the great prophet Elijah who came back to life to minister to our generation, and on the list went. And then Jesus asked the much more important question. That's fascinating what all these people are saying about me, but who do you say that I am? That's the only thing that really matters. And Peter, who almost always got it wrong, first try anyway, blurts out the correct answer while the others are still trying to figure out how to frame their response. Peter said, "Well, this is what I think. You are God's anointed one. You are the child of the living God." Peter, again I say, almost always got it wrong, but this time he hits the bullseye. Surprisingly, Jesus did not feign that Peter was so much on target. Instead, Jesus is pleased and responds, "Correct! And on the basis of this affirmation, you, Peter, I will build my church. And all the powers of evil will not prevail against the church." But something is very wrong in this story. Very, very wrong in this story. You know, sometimes you're watching a movie or reading a book, and even though careful editing, well, not the most careful editing, but some effort at careful editing has been done, something's out of place. I saw a clip of a movie a few years ago set in ancient Greece, and the Trojan soldiers were standing around in their armor. And if you took your eye off Brad Pitt and his fellow Trojans for a second, you will see what I'm pretty sure is a plane flying overhead. My younger son is great at catching these things. Obviously, there was not supposed to be a plane flying in ancient Greece. In the episode from the gospel literature that I recounted for you a few minutes ago, the word church should stand out like that airplane monitoring the Trojan War. The word church is so out of place because Jesus never knew about a church. Jesus did not dream about a church, make plans for a church, give instructions for a church, never attended a church. Jesus was a Jew from birth to death, as I often say. There were no churches in Jesus' time. Churches did not come into existence until the time of Paul. Church as an institution with the characteristics that we mean when we use the word church today. The story was created after Jesus' death, post-resurrection appearance kind of thing. I don't know how much later, but it was created to portray Peter as brilliant and insightful. It was intended to stress Jesus' closeness to Peter, and therefore to affirm Peter as Jesus' primary follower over against Mary Magdalene, whom many people were very distressed to find gaining a lot of supporters in the leadership vacuum that existed after Jesus departed this world. Further down the line, the Roman Catholic Church wanted to make Peter the first pope. In order for Peter to have had this special designation, he needed to have understood the church and had some sense of what the charge was from Jesus regarding the preservation of the church. So to recap, Jesus could not have spoken about building a church because no such thing as church existed in his lifetime. Jesus had no intention whatsoever of creating an organization that would center on him and try to turn its back on his Hebrew roots. He wanted to polish up his beloved Judaism, period. It was only, well, later, it was only later, 25 years or more after Jesus' execution, that Paul, who after Jesus' execution had been highly influenced by Jesus' teachings and established communities over in the Greek world that would exist over against a dominance of non-Jewish religious communities, and eventually different from the Judaism from which the Christians finally had to separate because of irreconcilable differences. Only then were churches, as we understand churches, born. And since then, we've seen the good, the grand, and the ugly. Various quarters within the institutional church have done countless good deeds in the arenas of ministry to the sick, to the needy, to the outcast, as well as mobilization of hordes of people to promote justice across the years, often by putting their own lives at risk. If you like the museum called Doctrine, the institutional church has done an amazing job of preserving those relics. We can cry because the old is passing away or has already passed off the scene, or we can rejoice, our choice, that we get to live in a time when necessity has passed along to us the opportunity to be a part of creating the new spirituality paradigm, which will someday have to be reshaped and reinvented, renamed again. But for a time will meet the needs of spiritual seekers for whom church as it has existed could not be meaningful. Deeds, not creeds, will be our motto, and this millennium we will really mean it. The Jesus we will carry with us into the spirituality community we are shaping is someone like any one of us who is wholeheartedly devoted to living out divine love, who is not a suitable subject for stained glass, and who could not possibly be remembered by an instrument of capital punishment. However, some might want to polish it up in all shapes and sizes and wear it as jewelry. There never was and never can be anything holy about a killer cross. In the new spirituality community paradigm, we will remember that Jesus lost his life for trying to preach love, but we will not glorify his grisly execution, much less celebrate it. Everything we do will be built or established around the fact that people and their circumstances are constantly changing and increasingly connected to what is going on in the wider world. The word translated church is ecclesia, which simply means called out ones. Called out. A group of people called out. Ultimately, the idea was they were called out for a specific responsibility or a specific set of responsibilities. Nothing more than that. So if Jesus ever said anything about building an organization, he said, I'm going to build my group of called out people into this kind of organization or this kind of community. You know? Beyond what I described a minute ago as how the church will change, including a new name, a spirituality community. Beyond that, things have fallen into our laps to recreate, not for eons at a time, more like for decades at a time, at most. This community can meet the demand. We can, you can, meet the demand for creating the new. And doing so will not only meet the needs of more people than we presently are able to meet, but will also teach us that the future is called the future and not the past for a reason. Bye.